This is his third session here. He had spoken about Geoff in Venice and Death in Varanasi as a preview to the festival yesterday. He spoke about writing about places, and this is his third book, which is about two books which are meditations on time going by, his life and his memories. And the specific focus of As Time Goes By will be his last two books, The Last Days of Roger Federer and Homework. In conversation with him is a dear friend of the festival, and whoever is here, I'd like everyone to give him a round of applause for gratitude, because he organized the fish cake yesterday that was cut on the stage for Amitav Ghosh, and all the goodies that were served thereafter. We had these fish-shaped shondesh. So thank you, Arunabha, for being such a friend and such an ally of the festival and managing to make my every wish come true. So over to you, Arunabha, and Geoff, please come. A round of applause for Geoff, who's been heroic. He's not very well, but he has still made it to both his sessions here.
Good afternoon. It's a privilege to be in conversation with the brilliant and inimitable Geoff Dyer, who says in one of the books that we'll discuss today that even though he's never met Roger Federer, he refers to him Roger, first name, and only and always Roger. So I've taken a cue from that, and I'll be referring to you by first name as well. I'll take the liberty. Personally, as someone who takes a bit of interest in Hindustani music, I was delighted to learn that Geoff has been deeply engaged with as a listener with Indian classical music over the last many decades. And he happened to mention to me that one of his favorite artists is Ustad Sultan Khan, the late and legendary Sarangi maestro. And while thinking about his body of work, Geoff's body of work that is, I realized maybe his body of work is not too dissimilar from that of Ustad Sultan Khan, in the sense that Khasab could easily shift between an intense 70-minute Jai Jayanti and then a folk song from Rajasthan, then sing a popular song, be part of a film music track. And he did that effortlessly and in a way which was always accessible, fun, but never too far away from what Matthew Arnold calls high seriousness. So I think, in a way, Geoff's body of work is very similar to that, in the way he shifts between the novel, the essay, criticism, and this genre-defying book that we'll discuss today, The Last Days of Roger Federer and Other Endings. If I can start with a question about this book, Geoff, which is that it's a book about endings, and you focus on three people mostly, if I may say, Nietzsche, Beethoven, and Turner. In spite of that, why is Roger Federer the eponymous character?
That's, yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, so when I was writing this book, there'd been a lot of talk about when Roger was going to retire, because a pattern had emerged that he would cruise through the early rounds of championships, then inevitably he'd get beaten by either Djokovic or Nadal. And it was interesting because he would always say the same thing, that he had no intention of retiring because this was what he liked doing. And it was quite interesting, this, and in great contrast to Bjorn Borg, who retired very, very early on, because for him being number one was everything. And the other thing is, of course, quite a lot of people who play tennis at some level, and Andre Agassi said this in his autobiography, he really hated tennis, he said. So it was this idea of, you know, what it feels like to sort of be in the twilight of your career. But I mean, in a sense, of course, I'm familiar with the way there's been a lot of writing in academia about late style. But in some cases, late and last are the same. So the classic case is Beethoven. Beethoven's late works are his last works, the string quartets and sonatas. But we can think of other examples of people whose last works come in what should have been their middle period. They just happen to die suddenly. So John Coltrane would be a classic example of that. The last works of Coltrane aren't really his late works, they're transitional works. And then we can keep bringing the end forward, and we can think of many novelists who, actually their last work is their first work. So this is a book about last things, and particularly about, well, two things. One, how you have a long career, and also, really importantly, what you do after the end. And it seemed to me this was all, I loved Roger so much, and he just seemed as a way of expressing in miniature many of these things. And then in Roger's case, of course, there was this wonderful kind of final blaze of light towards the end of his career when he adjusted his backhand and suddenly won the Australian, Wimbledon, maybe he won the Australian twice, I can't remember now, and just had this final sort of blaze of glory, which we appreciated all the more because by then we'd seen how fragile the beauty of Roger's game was.
Well, and given that it's about endings, it's also about time. And if we can relate that to the structure of the book a little bit, you make it a point to say that the book has 86,400 words, exactly without footnotes and the title, which amounts to the number of seconds in a day. And you have 3 sections, each has 60 subsections. So why did you consciously choose to structure it like that?
Yes, I'm so glad you've said that, because of course, whenever I publish a book, I wait for the reviews to come out declaring it to be yet another masterpiece. And I thought this one, they would say, not only is it a work of genius, it's particularly a work of structural genius. And in fact, when it came out, the reviews all said it was just an unstructured, it was really so enraging. And yeah, the structure is so intricate, actually. So, I liked the idea of it being a series of loops for various reasons. But to go back to something I mentioned yesterday, particularly Nietzsche's idea of the eternal recurrence, where at the end of your life, you just live that same life all over and over and over again. You're not reincarnated as something else. You're reincarnated as the same, leading the same life over and over again. So I was thinking about the filmic equivalents of that, and I could think of Groundhog Days, but the film I most thought of was Christian Marclay's 24-hour film, The Clock, whereby we get to midnight, then it just starts over again. And so I thought, wouldn't it be nice if in some way the book could sort of mirror that? And so I saw it was about sort of 90,000 words, and with careful editing and really some quite demanding mathematics keeping track of it, it ended up being I managed to get it to exactly 86,400 words, which I just kind of liked that as a sort of, just as a tightening of this structural thing. And of course, as you say, these loops that are made up of 60 parts. As soon as you get 60, well, that's the number of seconds in a minute or minutes in an hour. So yes, something about time is absolutely of the essence there. And yeah, that's what was going on. And also, crucially, I think, the argument advances not in a sort of chapter by chapter way. So there might be bits where the reader might think that I've sort of lost my mind, because there's a section on Gillian Welch about how I first came across her music. And then the next bit is about something else. So the reader might be thinking, God, what on earth has gone on here? And then, we go through a few more bits, and I end up in Turin, and then I start talking about Nietzsche's breakdown, and then it links back to Gillian Welch. So there's quite often, what I was hoping would happen is that the reader would soon have enough trust in me to feel that there's often a sort of element, the narrative is progressing, but it's progressing through a series of suspensions, if you like, and nearly everything that is sort of mentioned is then picked up again later, but not in a sort of not in a normal narrative form. So it does require a certain trust on the part of the reader. And the same figures, as you've so rightly said, I mean, Turner, Beethoven, and Nietzsche, they crop up throughout the book.
And since you mentioned the idea of the eternal recurrence, you also mentioned how essentially that is living the same moment again and again, but how you could also have your choice of moment, that which moment in your life do you want to keep reliving?
Well, you see, that's the key thing about the eternal recurrence. You can't just pick and choose When I was a kid, there was this thing in sweet shops called pick and mix. So you'd get all these, these quality streets, they would be called, and you could, if you liked strawberry creams, you could just fill up your bucket with strawberry creams. But with Nietzsche's idea, you can't just pick the good bits, that would be, of course, we'd all like that. He says, if you live this moment all over again, you've got to live that moment. And so this has all sorts of implications. So to give one very clear kind of thing, I mean, Nietzsche keeps saying, it comes up in many passages in his book. He says, this idea of living your life over and over again, it's a terrible thing, isn't it? And we can all think of these moments that are terrible, but then he says, has there been a single moment in your life so great that it redeems all the others? Okay, so when I was writing the book, here's a boast, but it's true. My life was a lot better than Boris Becker's, because Boris Becker was in jail for bankruptcy. So given the choice, he'd much rather have been living my life than his. Okay, so that's good for me. I've sort of got the better of Boris Becker. But then you think, Boris Becker wins Wimbledon twice as a teenager. And you think, maybe those moments were so great that he would settle for somebody with frankly, every year he'd have a new haircut, which was incredibly even worse than the one he'd had the previous year. And maybe he'd even settle for being in jail in Britain. And then you think of even, if you think of people tennis is one thing, but if you think of somebody who'd risen to these unbelievable heights, heights way beyond any writer or anyone can achieve. If you think of another person whose life ends rather tragically, Diego Maradona. But just think of that moment when he wins the World Cup single-handedly. It's just, he would, in a weird way, Maradona, who made so many mistakes in his life, but in a weird way, the key thing is you can't just pick and choose the good bits. Similarly, we think of Roger, we've discussed this, we were discussing this privately, when he has those 2 match points against Djokovic in his last Wimbledon final. Of course, he must have been wishing, if only I'd served differently, if only, but the thing is, he can't change those 2 points. He'd have to change everything, and overall, he'd have been quite satisfied with his tennis life.
No, and speaking of choosing the moment and thinking about lost opportunities, you also quote from The Tempest, Prospero's speech, where he says that when he goes back to Milan, and every third thought shall be my grave, and then you sort of try to imagine what the other 2/3 will comprise. And just a question, because you're a Roger fan, that if Roger had to choose between 2nd July 2001, when he beat Pete Sampras and had a decade of domination to look forward to, and 14 July 2019, when he was 8-7 up in the 5th set, which do you think he'd choose?
It's impossible to say, isn't it? Yeah, but there are so many. But that's the thing with these tennis players. What we keep hearing about them, about the sporting mentality, and it's a phrase that has great resonance for our session. We always hear that they have to wash the clock, that you just put out of your mind. You mustn't have those kind of thoughts and regrets. And it's very different to me. I kind of regret almost every moment of my life. I'm in a state of constant regret. But yeah, it's very. I think Roger, if Roger were here sitting being interviewed by you, I suspect he would reject your question.
Yes, I have no doubts about that at all, actually. No, and we'll make a slight shift. It's a book about endings, and you mentioned that in this book, that, and particularly because we are in a Lit Fest, it's been rebranded as Rediscover, as an R-E-A-D, Rediscover. But you talk of the many books you find it impossible to finish. And I was so reassured to see a few names on that list that I've also not been able to go through. If you can just tell us a little bit about a few books that you've not been able to finish, why, and your thoughts on that.
Yes, yes. Oh, well, I mean, yeah, I guess so I should explain, this isn't just a book about these gigantic figures, you know, like Beethoven, Turner, and Nietzsche. It's also about my sort of being in, I guess, my sort of twilight years in many ways. And I'm sort of very conscious that, I really don't want to go to my grave without having read, most of the great books. But, it's looking now increasingly unlikely that I will ever finish Proust, because I always end up stopping at the same time. And as I get older, when I was young, I had this kind of slavish idea that I would be improved, but I read the whole of The Idiot by Dostoevsky, even though I didn't enjoy it, because I thought it would be improving in some way. And I didn't finish Brothers Karamazov, and I think now, weirdly, I've got less stamina than I did when I was young. And other things, I mean, I feel that's my fault entirely. I feel much more confident about delivering some verdicts. I really think Nostromo by Conrad is a terrible book, actually. And similarly, I mean, Anthony Powell, The Dance to the Music of Time, 12 volumes. My father-in-law was very keen on it. I read 5 volumes. That translates to about 1,400 pages, and it seemed to me really no good at all. And then, of course, my father-in-law, when I said I'd given it up, he said, "Oh, well, it really gets going in volume 6." But I just didn't have there was nothing. I didn't feel there was anything in it that was going to reward me, so that's the thing. So it's about also, I mean, the moment when people decide to give up on their writing careers or their artistic careers for whatever reason, but also about other kind of endings when you just decide to stop doing something in your normal life.
No, and you also say in this book that you've always disliked preciousness in writing and in authors, and also earnestness to some extent.
Yes.
So I just thought, if you had to write an Amos like war against something, not cliche, would it be against preciousness?
Well, no, I mean, in that regard, there are so many jihads that I would like to wage against so many things. I'm not sure, I mean, we can take them in turn. I mean, preciousness that's very off-putting in writing. Earnestness, it's more, I mean, Nietzsche, I don't want to talk too much about Nietzsche, but of course he's known as a philosopher, but I think really, I mean, what he is, I mean, two things. One, he's a writer. I mean, I think I can't really read philosophy, but I can read Nietzsche. With my inadequate understanding of philosophy, I suppose, does that logically mean he's not a philosopher? And he just has this great line about earnestness. He says, earnestness, the sure sign of a slow mind," which I think is one of his great sort of just off-the-cuff psychological insights. And there's a number of things like that. And I suppose it links in this idea of sort of earnestness, and it's sort of often closely related to seriousness. And it's very, very important to me that it's a line of G.K. Chesterton's when he says, "What's the opposite of funny?" And we instinctively think, oh, the opposite of funny, that's serious. But of course, no, the opposite of funny is not funny. And it's it's so at the heart of what I do that you can be serious and funny, not alternating, but at exactly the same time. And again, it's Nietzsche was Nietzsche was in his weird, mad way. He was very keen on jokes.
Right. I think we can use Nietzsche to segue into your next book, which is your memoir, Homework, to say that your first Nietzsche was brought home by your mother.
Yes.
Even though you say in great detail, and that's a large part of the book, how your parents were not readers, but to sort of instill your interest.
Yeah, when I was getting into reading books, I mean, she always liked sort of finding bargains. So although she wasn't a reader at all, she was able to sort of identify the kind of books that, the sort of Penguin classics and stuff. So she would see them in second-hand shops, which she loved to go in, and she would bring them back home. And I still have that copy of Zarathustra that she brought home, which is both Nietzsche's... It's funny, I mean, the reassuring thing about Nietzsche as well is that, I mean, it's a difficult competition to be. I wonder who would come out on top if the competition was who was the biggest loser, who was the most unsuccessful out of Van Gogh and Nietzsche. Because Nietzsche was, I mean, he really believed that Zarathustra, he said, is the greatest gift that's ever been given to mankind, and it sold about 200 copies. And, then, of course, in the First World War, every German soldier, I think, was sent to the front line with a little pocket edition of Nietzsche, so his fortunes changed. But actually, that's his most famous book, and also his worst book by some margin, I think, which is another thing that often comes up, that the very book that makes somebody most famous can often be their worst.
Right. And speaking of books and your parents, you mentioned in your memoir that while your mother was getting you the books, the more you read sort of intensified your aloneness, I think that's the word you use, and your distance from them, and maybe some sort of an inability to communicate.
Yeah. I mean, so when I didn't have any brothers or sisters, so I spent a lot of when the American editor saw this book, he said, "Oh my God, can we have a little less stuff about all the toys and all the collecting you did as a kid, and more about the human relationships which come a bit later?" And I was saying, well, what you don't understand is that if you're an only child, your relationships are with your toys and your things and all this stuff that I collected. And what happened is essentially, I mean, at some point, due to the influence of a teacher at school, sort of books, reading, that sort of whooshed in to fill the vacuum left by all this sort of stuff, all these toys and model aeroplanes that I collected as a kid. And then really what this book is actually about, so it's about, I should explain for those of you who don't know it, it's a book about my life from the age of 0 in 1958 to when I'm 18 and got a place at Oxford in 1977, I guess. And, and nothing much happens in that time, except that towards the end I just keep passing exams. And really what it is in in my particular, it's my particular story in great, I mean, granular detail, in incredible detail in a way. But what it illustrates is a particular phase of British social history, I think. And the process I've undergone tells you something about the changing Britain, that thanks to various sort of opportunities that come my way, somebody born into a working class family can find themselves at Oxford, and that's a great thing. Of course, I'm immensely grateful, but, and this is a widespread, widely documented thing, there is this kind of thing of the sort of grammar school boys syndrome, whereby you end up out of the world you were born into, and a sort of a gap emerges between you and the world you were from. And as I say, it's very, very well documented in English literature, but there are also versions of it you think there are versions of it. Camus writes about exactly the same experience in that novel that he was writing when he died. I can't remember what it was called, The Last or The First Man.
Right. And the other aspect that, when you mention that it's about a period in Britain or a study of Britain, and you also quote Lawrence, who you've engaged with deeply, to say that England, the country of my heart. So would you sort of echo that?
Yes, in the country of one's heart. It's Lawrence, I should say, is referring to a very specific
That's right, yes.
sort of part of Nottingham where he was from, not very far from where I was brought up. And I think also the country of your heart, or a place, tends to be anchored in time as well. So although I don't think I have a nostalgic bone in my body, actually, but certainly this is wanting to be, it's not an elegy for, but it's kind of wanting to preserve an England which I think has now vanished, because, I was in this wonderful position whereby, I get there's this education for free. I go to Oxford, that's all free, and I leave university without any debts at all. And then, when I left university, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I had just one big ambition, which is that I wanted to sign on the dole and live on benefits. And those days are gone, of course. And really that era, let's say, that era lasting from the setting up of the welfare state in 1945 through to the it ended with the election of Margaret Thatcher. That's the kind of period that I feel so. I feel so fortunate to be the beneficiary of these opportunities that came my way.
Right, and when we speak of looking back, you also speak about looking at, and you see this family photograph that you find, a color photograph from a day out.
This one, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you speak about that photo in detail. So in this context, if you can, and you've had long engagement with the visual arts and the visual medium, if you could speak about that a little bit, and also the influence of John Berger.
Yes, well, yeah. So it's a particularly lovely picture. It's me, my mum and dad, and our car, and you probably can't see it, but there I am, this little sort of only child, and I've got this lovely blow-up sort of creature. So he was my sort of companion. Although and there's too much to go into, but there's something about this picture which really sums up in a way that the essence of my childhood, and also it says something quite interesting about the way pictures can serve as a substitute for memory, because I actually have no memory at all of this picture being taken or of that outing, but because there's a picture there. To make a very obvious point, we all remember, if you're in England, if you're English, we all remember our childhoods as being radiantly sunny. But that's really because of the photographs we have, because back then people wouldn't take photographs unless there was enough light, which there often wasn't in Britain. And my dad, particularly if you had a dad like mine who really, and if there's one thing that he hated in life, it was spending money. He was certainly not going to waste a valuable frame of film on a dark day. So that's about photographs generally. And I think, it's difficult. John Berger has been so hugely important to me as a writer. It was my coming across his work after I'd left university. When I left university, it seemed to me if you were interested in writing, there were two ways of being a writer. You could either be a novelist, a fiction writer, or you could be a critic, which meant you wrote about other people's fiction. And Berger offered another way whereby you could do a form of writing which was both imaginative and criticism, and a form of writing that was both creative and a form of commentary. So all sorts of possibilities emerged, and also really, really crucially, the range of his the range of his concerns, which really, after, I did 8 O-levels, 3 A-levels, and a degree in English. And then, of course, the next stage in that is you go on to the unbelievable concentration of a PhD, which in English often means you find somebody so uninteresting that nobody's yet been able to sort of gather up the energy to research this person. So it goes in a kind of, you're funneled into an ever-increasing specialism. And I discovered John Berger at an early stage of my sort of post-university life, when I was also, and he was interested in so many things. And I always remember Susan Sontag's, she's saying, the definition of a writer is somebody who's interested in everything. So she, and various others gave me this confidence to think that I could write on sort of almost any subject that interested me. That's been a real foundational principle of my non-career. Yeah.
And amongst the many things you write about music in great detail and a variety of music. But my question is that while you were so interested in music all your life, did you ever learn anything or practice? Because there's the image of that piano in your grandfather's house, which is never played.
Yeah, there was quite often a weird thing in working class homes. You'd have a piano, but quite often there was just a sort of piece of furniture, really. That particular piano, I'm convinced that even Keith Jarrett wouldn't have been able to play it. It had no music in it. And then, of course, when I really got into rock music, and I'd tried to successfully persuaded my dad to buy a sort of, early on, a mono record player. This is back in the, let's say, the early 60s. So he was happy to do that. It wasn't so expensive. But then something awful happened. He realized that it wasn't just the record player, because each week there'd be a new thing on the hit parade, and each week there'd be new singles to buy. So we realized this thing that was a record player wasn't just a record player, it was a portal to unstoppable expenditure. So he underfunded that. And then later on, when I was in my teens, of course, when I was really now into listening to music, I wanted a guitar. And he bought me a guitar nicely. But, two things. One, I'm left-handed. So that was a real disadvantage because, of course, there is one very famous exception of somebody who was left-handed and was able to play the guitar. But bear in mind that I wasn't able to read music, and although he bought me a guitar, he wasn't going to pay for music lessons. So, what do I do with this thing? And, it's funny, a lot of kids, even a lot of even quite stupid people can learn to play the guitar. But the truth is, it's actually almost impossible to learn the guitar, I discovered, and I got fed up with it after about probably 3 weeks. And that then justified my dad. Whenever I wanted anything after that, he'd be able to say, you really wanted a guitar, and you soon got fed up with that. And there were quite a few things like that. I really wanted a pet. I wanted a rabbit. So he built a hutch. He got a rabbit, built a hutch for it, and then, of course, it turns out when you've got a pet rabbit, all the rabbit can do is just go to the toilet in its hutch. So, of course, I really hated that rabbit, and I lost all interest in it in about a week. So I was really glad when I came home one day to find that the rabbit had been disappeared and the hutch was dismantled. So, there was a lot of this kind of... I think there's a larger thing going on here. When my dad was growing up in the 1930s, very short of money, but of course there was not much to spend money on, really. And then all the sort of conflicts that emerged with my dad, they were kind of not just generational, but they were sort of epochal, like different epochs, in that his well-developed sense of really having to save money and be very austere. I was growing up in an era when there was more and more sort of affluence and more stuff becoming available, which I wanted, whereas he couldn't really, there wasn't anything for him. And then in some ways, though, I feel a great gratitude to have been the child of my dad's frugality, because now when I'm in London or somewhere and I see these stores called, I don't know what they're called, Dolce and Gabbana or something like that, and I see these people going in buying all these things, I always feel, God, what are these places? They're places of heightened expense, but they're actually places of diminished value, cheapened value, So, and yeah, I guess, in a weird way, my parents' attitude to things, we would now call it sustainability, and I'm glad I didn't grow up with this idea that if I don't have the latest Nike trainers, I'm somehow lacking in purpose or value in life.
Speaking of austerity, may I request you to read, I know we didn't plan this bit, the one about the razors, I think it's at page 14.
Page 14?
14, I think, yeah.
Okay.
Is one of the funniest bits in the book. Yes.
So this is, is it 14 though? I'm having trouble finding it. See, we should have... Oh, yes, you're right. You're absolutely. Here we are. Yeah, this is about my dad shaving in the kitchen. Blah blah blah. So after he's finished shaving, the razors were not thrown away, but recycled back into their box to be used by my mum to shave her shins. After which they were still not thrown out. Their functional life was ended, but they had some as yet undiscovered potential use, even if they were so blunt as to have rendered suicide almost impossible. Given sufficient determination, you could have attempted to saw away at your wrists, but the effort and time involved would have reawakened a sense of purpose, synonymous with the will to live. So yeah, there's that little bit there.
And since we've come to readings, there's one other bit that I've requested Geoff to read. It's a few words as to why. He mentions that in his vocabulary, sweet, the word sweet, is used both as an adjective and a noun. And I told him that even in Bengal, mishti is both an adjective and a noun. Have some mishti means have some sweet, and it's also an adjective. So there's a brilliant passage on sweets and sugar. So if we can have a bit of that.
Sure. My childhood was saturated in sugar. I loved sugar on and in everything. All forms of Cadbury's chocolate, Lucasade, sugar and sugar-drenched jam in semolina, sugary rice pudding, sugar anything. So thoroughly did sugar permeate everything I ate, even slightly later, yogurt, the first suggestion of what would later come under the heading healthy eating, that I was not even conscious of sweetness, only of its intolerable absence. Nothing was ever too sweet. How could it be, though certain things inevitably required more sugar than others? It wasn't that I had a sweet tooth, I had a normal tooth, a tooth that craved sugar. Not for nothing were our most desired foodstuffs known collectively as sweets. In America, sweets are called candy, but sweet is much better, an adjective that has achieved the status of noun and thing. Far from discouraging this fondness for sugar, my parents instilled and then endorsed it by their own gradually increasing sugar intake, their absolute abhorrence of, more a kind of astonishment about, anything lacking in sugar. Tea without sugar was not just horrible to them, it was an abuse of their human rights. The assumption was that nothing really tasted of anything, because the only taste that counted was sweetness, sugariness. I must not exaggerate. We did not put sugar on chocolates or sweets, did not add sugar to Kellogg's sugar-coated Frosties or the aptly named Sugar Puffs, because they were already so loaded with sugar, it would have been impossible to make them taste more sugary. These were not drinks or food with sugar added. They were sugars in liquid or cereal form. Everything else, though, cried out for sugar, heaped spoons of it from the dozens of packets stacked up in the pantry, partly hoarding in the face of potential shortage, but also because even as a family of three, we got through such huge quantities of excuse me, huge quantities of it at a phenomenal rate. Sugar, lovely sugar, not the cause of obesity and harbinger of diabetes as we now think of it, but a source of pleasure and nutrition and energy. We are talking exclusively of white sugar. Even brown sugar was too sophisticated, an acquired taste with suggestions of a health fad. It was practically muesli or brown rice in granular form. Blah, blah, blah. There's a lot. It goes on for ages, this passage, so I'll skim a bit. And the extraordinary thing, it did us no harm. My mum and dad lived to 85 and 90 respectively, and for the last 20 years of their long lives, the tea they drank was so dense with sugar, it was more like a thick, highly sweetened brown sludge than a drink. Have I got diabetes? Have I turned into a fat slob, a fat anything? Look at me, whip it thin, fiddle fit, and raised almost exclusively on a diet of white sugar. I should say that, thank you, I really hated all the food that we ate at home, except for one thing, a sugar sandwich. That was the only thing.
No, and whip it thin, fiddle fit indeed, but what's the update on your own tennis?
Oh yeah, I've several things. Well, I retired from tennis, partly because I'd loved Roger so much that my interest in watching tennis diminished. And also I was finding that, I just wasn't my game was deteriorating. And, I was getting more and more injuries, and also it would leave me so wrung out for days afterwards that although I was happy sort of playing, then that was great and I'd like it, but then I'd have such trouble getting out of bed the next day. So it's funny, if you'd asked me 2 years ago what would life be like without playing tennis, I'd have said terrible. But it's funny actually, since I've given up since I've given up playing tennis, I haven't regretted it for a moment. I mean, there's a great joy in not being interested in things. I discovered very early on that not being interested in theatre is a great source of happiness. Just like every day I wake up thinking, oh, how great, I'm not playing chess today. I discovered that when I was about 12, yes.
No, and you also mentioned in homework that you played a bit of tennis with your father. And I'll also skip towards the end of the book when you speak about your father's passing. You also mentioned that there is no afterlife and that you have to keep living on in his name.
Yeah.
Even though you were two very different people in terms
Yes.
of how you led your lives.
Yes.
That's quite a moving bit.
Well, yeah, I should say as well that, of course, I wrote this book after, in that sort of period after my parents had died. And of course, this is something we all are familiar with, those of us whose parents have died. I mean, I'm aware of so many qualities in them that I'm more conscious of that than ever before. And, I mean, this is a nice sort of thing, actually. I did this thing at the Cheltenham Literature Festival, big literature festival in the town I was born in. So I was returning. It was my triumphal return to my hometown. And, I thought I was coming home like, when the astronauts came back from the moon, there was a ticker tape welcome. And I was kind of looking forward to that.
Or when Ivanovic went back after winning his only Wimbledon.
Indeed. Anyway, for some reason, I don't know, maybe they don't have ticker tape in Cheltenham or something. But anyway, I did this event at the Literature Festival, and it was great. It was great. Then afterwards, my cousin, who I hadn't seen for years, she said, oh, he's got his dad's laugh. And I was nothing that was said to me that weekend gave me quite as much happiness as the idea that my dad's laugh would persist in me. Now, my dad's laugh wasn't something that occurred that often, but it would occur with a kind of smirk. I mean, he was so unbelievably tight with money. And I mean, there's lots of stuff in the book about how mean my dad was with money, but I don't feel guilty about it because whenever a relative commented on how tight with money he was, he wouldn't take it as an insult. He would have he would laugh with a kind of satisfaction that I'd had as a writer in Cheltenham, because finally he'd feel that one of his great qualities had been recognised. So it was a source of great pleasure to him when my Uncle Darrell said of my dad that he was so mean that even if he had a mouthful of gumballs, he still wouldn't give you one.
Thank you. If there are any questions from the audience, Yes.
Hi. Hi, Geoff. As a novelist and now as a memoirist, I was wondering about the narrative voice and the unreliable narrator in memoirs. Is that something that you had to contend with?
Yes, thank you. Well, I mean, you say as a novelist and then a memoirist, but I've never considered myself a novelist or a travel writer or an essayist. To me, just being a writer has been enough, and it's, to me, it's all the same, really. You just sort of sit there and go like that, So it didn't really require any difficult thing. I think I had a particular voice that was acquired relatively early on, and it was a very distinct voice precisely because I was so susceptible to influence. And in my 20s, I was just reading so much and so influenced by different people. 1 week it would be Roland Barthes, then it would be, Joseph Brodsky, and then Don DeLillo. I mean, at that stage, and then however influenced I was by all these people, let's say Roland Barthes, for example, I was desperate to write like Roland Barthes. But whenever I did it, it would all come out still sort of sounding sort of not quite like them. Anyway, you pour all these influences in, and then you end up with a voice that is uniquely your own, which is why, of course, like all writing teachers say to students, you've got to read a lot, So there's that. As for the sort of reliability, well, this book is a bit different because whereas I've published a lot of non-fiction books published as non-fiction, where, not everything really happened. But that doesn't matter because the things that happen in my books are so trivial. It's really not like, I'm never selling a book because it's the true story of how I was eaten by a shark and swam across 100 miles of ocean to make it, there's none of that sort of stuff. With this writing a memoir, though, you have an obligation, really, a sort of contractual obligation with the form to be as faithful to what really happened as you can be, or more exactly, I should say, and this is a point I made yesterday, you've got to be as faithful as possible to your memory of what happened, and of course sometimes that's in conflict with the documentary record. And since the book's been published, a number of people have pointed out things that have got wrong, which I'm not going to correct in subsequent editions, but I will include a postscript explaining that these things were not entirely accurate. Thank you.
There's one question there.
Yeah. Hello, Geoff. Yeah. So, in your Color of Memory, you had written that nostalgia is something that we can manufacture. So, do you think right now, as you've written a memoir, how true do you still believe that nostalgia is something that you have manufactured?
Yes. It's funny with this book. It's quite a lot of people have said in a very sort of praising way that it's a sort of great festival of nostalgia. I'm not sure it is. What it is, it's a very detailed recreation of a particular era of British history. And I suppose it is possible to sort of to lament or feel elegiac for that. But I think it's more just the vividness and the way that it's rendered that's important. That's my feeling about that. Thank you.
Are there any more questions? We have one there.
Hi, Geoff. I was just wondering about the structure. Did you have a problem selling that structure to your publisher?
Oh, that's a great thing. Thank you. I mean, the crucial thing, the most important thing to say about my way of working is that I never write proposals and I never try to sell a book to a publisher in advance, because you probably feel the same. Don't you hate it when somebody's trying to sell you anything? So, and I can't bear doing that. I just never write proposals. I just write the book, and then I give the book to my agent, and then it's up to them to sell it. And this has worked very well for me because it's worked very well for me because I can't think of any other way of doing it. But also, crucially, I mean, a number of the books I've done have been completely unpublishable. So, for example, just this one instance, there's this book of mine called Zona, where I summarize in incredible detail, scene by scene detail, Andrei Tarkovsky's film Stalker. Imagine trying to sell that to a publisher as a proposal. It's just not going to happen. But if you actually write the book, then they might say, this is rather interesting. So if you're interested in publishing unpublishable books, that's the only way to do it. And I should say that actually, from my point of view, books that are not immediately publishable, books that aren't the story of how I was eaten by a shark, how I had a leg bitten off by a shark, or there's loads of stuff in non-fiction books that I really hate. There's so often manifest in the subtitles, like how three pot-smoking kind of hippies undermined the world order. That kind of stuff. It's there's no selling at all. So the other thing, of course, is, I should have said this, I don't have an idea of the structure in advance. What I do is I accumulate a certain amount of material, and then in the course of writing it, a structure will emerge which is hopefully uniquely suited to that particular subject matter. And I think also there's a kind of, I just hate the idea that if you're offering somebody as a proposal, I mean, I really love the freedom of writing. So the idea that I'm going to have to sell you, let's say you work at a publisher, the idea that I'm going to have to get the publisher's permission to do what I want to do, that would make a mockery of my whole life. Yeah. Anyway, it's probably a very bad way of going about things in terms of a career, so don't take any notice of that.
Right, we'll take two questions, Nandini and Shashwato, if...
Good afternoon, and thank you for making me feel less guilty about dropping books left, right, and center. So which authors or books you haven't dropped and which you like reading or you go to very often? It would be a great one to know.
Oh, yes. Okay, I can come up with a long list of these, but I'll mention just a book that I read maybe 4 years ago, which was a reminder of what I got into reading for Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. A book that once you're into it, wherever you're not even conscious of the words in the page, you're just there in Montana where the action is taking place. That would be one example. There are loads of others as well, though.
And something on the dry humor lines.
Oh, You want a book recommendation of
Yes,
dry
absolutely.
humour?
This is a lit fest after all.
Yes, you're right. Well, I find that Austrian writer Thomas Bernhard incredibly funny, and that's so dry. It's almost parched. So one of his books, let's say, Correction. And I have a particular love of, I feel I've got a great sense of humor, which is why if I watch a film by the Coen brothers, I sit there absolutely stony-faced. So.
The question was because we all loved your sense of humor.
Good, thank you.
Right. Thanks, Nandini. One last question from...
Hi, I just had a tennis question for you. Who was your childhood tennis idol? Who's the guy or girl you saw playing and were like, that's the guy who's hooking me into tennis? And secondly, for a large generation of people, there's an affinity people feel to Federer because he's, in essence, he's the last truly great player who's going to play in a certain style with a one-handed backhand, who could play the net. And there's probably never going to be another player like that. I wonder if part of, the way you feel about Federer is people, my generation feel about him as well. We will never love a player as much as we love him. And how much do you feel that specific style and it's going extinct plays into that?
Yes,
He said the magic word, hasn't he? The one-handed backhand.
Yes, exactly. That's so true. Well, of course, somebody of my age, I of course liked John McEnroe, because of his sort of, McEnroe was a total brat, of course, but it seemed to incarnate some sort of punk feeling of taking on the Wimbledon. It would be full of these kind of, these sort of establishment umpires who were often, they didn't even have such good eyesight. So I liked his whole rebelliousness, that kind of thing. And of course, that's when so many of us got interested in tennis. And now, of course, what I want from tennis, from any sport, more than anything, is sportsmanship. So I look back and I think, oh, what a terrible sport McEnroe was. And one of the things that I do like about Sinner and Alcaraz, I love the sportsmanship. But yes, Federer, here's I think the key thing. The one-handed backhand is so important. If you're at a tennis match and somebody hits a one-handed backhand, you'll always hear this kind of groan when somebody does it, a collective groan of because it's so wonderful and beautiful. And I've not been very interested in women's tennis for several years now, not because I'm like Bobby Riggs, a male chauvinist pig, but one of the reasons is the one-handed backhand has been extinct in the women's game since Justine Ardern, I think. The thing with Roger, of course, was that typically in tennis, you've got this opposition between the aesthetic thing and the pragmatic side. In football you get it a lot. It might not look pretty, but it's efficient. And then what happened with Roger in that last phase of his life, when we'd seen how fragile that backhand was, then we got this thing where for a brief moment, the most beautiful way of playing tennis was also the most efficient. And it was just by then, after those years in the sort of semi-wilderness, then we'd really learned to appreciate how special it was to get this coming together of extreme beauty and it actually being a winning way to play. And now one of the reasons, even though Sinner and Alcaraz can hit the ball so hard, it's not aesthetically pleasing. The two-handed backhand is an inherently ugly move to make. Anyway, it's an audience of Federer loyalists.
There are very few writers whose spectrum would include Nietzsche's eternal recurrence and Federer's one-handed backhand. It's been a privilege speaking with you. Thank you very much.
Pleasure speaking with you. Great.
Thank you.